Hi, welcome to Salon Talks. Our guest this week is Amanda Little, the author of The Fate of Food. Amanda.
Hi. Pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. So, reading this book, you open this book, it's an amazing scene about being in a survival food factory, and it seems to me like it dawns on you that the question of food security and where food is going is suddenly presented you in stark relief. Like, this is really happening. People are really preparing for there to be no food.
I actually ended up at this Salt Lake City facility for Wise Foods, which is a leading brand in survival food, in part because a number of people in my life were beginning to stockpile food. And one of them is my brother, who is a climate scientist at the Nature Conservancy. So he's very well versed in climate data and the models and the predicting where we're going to be in 20, 30 years. But then I also had some other folks. My cousin-in-law, who's a former cop in Indiana, was putting long storage food in his basement for 6 months to a year. My stepbrother, who is an executive in downtown Washington D.C., was stockpiling food in his urban basement, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? I am certainly not someone who is as concerned about our food future, and I need to.
Am I missing something?
Am I missing something?
And you also knew how hard it was to make food because you had a backyard garden that was a great challenge to you.
It is.
As it is to many.
Yes, I am an avid eater. Yeah. I'm not a very virtuous eater, and I have little kids, and I am sort of aware. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, which is not exactly Berkeley, California, but we have lots of backyard gardeners and people with chicken coops and Paleolithic diets and this kind of thing. And I sort of had gotten wind of the fact that there was this sort of DIY, sustainable food movement going on, and just wasn't really pulling it off. We tried and still try to raise vegetables and fruits in our backyard, and haven't had very good results with it. I mean, we invest far more than we actually save in growing our own fruits and vegetables.
It's not cheaper.
No, it's not cheaper. Yeah. It is for some people who are good at it. Right. I just don't happen to be one of them. I also work full time and cook last minute, and I, have tried to give up meats, and I've tried to do only sort of organic and GMO and free and all these things. And I just have found that it's so time intensive that I didn't, I can't pull it off. And so the sort of guiding question for this book came to be, how are we going to fix a failing food system if we can't necessarily rely on a critical mass of, backyard farming vegetarians to fix it from the ground up?
Right.
And I had dinner with Michael Pollan 5 years ago when he came through town, and I said, hey, I love this notion of eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I'm not great at it. How do we do a 100% sustainable food system that, can sort of work for everyone and not just this sort of group of wealthy, virtuous eaters?
Right. Because that's happening for that market, right?
That's right. I mean, there are plenty of people who are getting on board with, the farm-to-table sustainable food movement, and it's certainly growing very quickly. But it's still a small fraction of people, and it's largely, wealthy people who have the time and resources to invest in that kind of lifestyle. So I was also worried about and wondering about, as these environmental pressures kick up and climate change begins to put more and more pressure on food systems around the world, right, how do we do sustainability on a grand scale?
Right.
And he kind of said, that's a really interesting question. Someone should write that book. Or that's what I heard him say. And so 5 years later, I am here talking about the fate of food.
Fate of food, yes.
And that's kind of the story. I mean, there were so many different, catalysts for me with this book.
Right.
As a sort of food world imposter, I'm not,
well, you're hardly an imposter.
I wasn't
it's
an
a valiant effort, right?
Thank you. Well, now, having been steeped in this for 5 years,
you're an expert.
I feel like I've gotten some chops. But I'm not, I didn't come at it as a food activist or as a chef or as someone who has, lives inside the food world. And I've been an environmental reporter for 20 years, and I've been writing about energy and water and all kinds of sort of ways into the story of climate change.
Right.
And it occurred to me that the main way we're all going to experience climate change, I mean, that means all of us 7.5 billion people currently alive, and in 2050, the 9.5 billion people who we're expecting will be alive. That the main way all of us are going to experience climate change is through its impacts on food. There will be certainly populations displaced by flooding and mega drought and heat and forest fires, but those will be very region specific. The entire world is going to feel some way or another these impacts on food systems.
And they're going to move towards the food, right?
And they're going to move toward the food. Right. And so given this double whammy kind of challenge, one is redressing the problems of our industrial food system and sort of the existing system today, which is so flawed, as we know. And then also beginning to sort of prepare for these pressures that are, intensifying from climate change. How are we going to feed ourselves in the next 30 years? That became a really interesting challenge and sort of question that got me deeper and deeper into the food systems and into specific issues like, how are we going to, what do meat? Are we going to have to move to an animal-free meat future? Are we going to build a drought-proof water supply to, actually sustain farms? Are we going to have to do GMOs, and can we do GMOs well?
Growing fish.
Yeah. How do we get chemicals out of the food system?
Yeah.
How do we do aquaculture sustainably? Is that possible? Right. So that was like, I thought this one question, would be sort of an interesting one to explore. Right. And then it got me deeper and deeper into these other, more specific questions. So the book has a big range. It's sort of, how do we feed the world? But it also gets very specific.
Yeah,
and I get, meet sort of scientists and farmers and innovators all approaching this from different perspectives.
So you went to meat because meat, livestock production is the most impactful, has more impact on climate than all transportation issues, right?
That's right. Well, food broadly, what we eat generally has a greater impact on, climate change and the environment than, what we drive or how we get ourselves from point A to point B by flying or driving. So yes, agriculture has a greater impact than transportation, all forms of transportation combined when we think about climate change. And meat in particular is really intensive. The statistic that kind of amazes me the most, I think, and there are so many, but more than 30% of all the grains we grow, corn, soy, in particular, go to meat production. Less than 5%, I believe, of what we grow on our farms is actually fruits and vegetables. The vast majority of what we grow is grains, and so many of those grains go to livestock production and, of course, ethanol. But meanwhile, all these new sort of middle-income populations that are coming online in emerging economies are demanding more meat. And in the last 50 years, I believe, global population has doubled, but demand for meat has tripled. So it's not even just that populations are growing, it's that diets are changing and they're shifting toward more and more meat consumption. And so
because meat is affordable to more people, as well as there being more people that coming, there are also more people that can afford suddenly to eat meat, and they prefer it. Vegetarianism is a choice, but if you ask 10 people, 7 of them will choose meat.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And
it's
you
something
can't-
like 90% of the global population consumes meat.
Okay.
I
I was going to go crazy and say 8 out of 10, but
Yeah,
9.
no, 9 out of 10,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so this is really, and as I said, I'm a New Yorker, but I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and it's been humbling to me to sort of begin to think about this in an environment where meat is very much a part of the culture and the tradition, and I'm surrounded every other corner. There's like an amazing barbecue joint or hot chicken
you're
joint,
in the right town.
and and so my efforts to become vegetarian and even vegan have been thwarted, in part because, I'm with a lot of people who really, not only enjoy meat, but see it as very much a part of their cultural identity. Right. And that's true for cultures all over the world. But it's important when we think about this, because if you have this conversation in San Francisco or even New York, it's sort of like, we can all eat sweet greens and, tofu burgers and impossible burgers, and this is...
If we want, but we don't want, as it turns out. Right?
And well, you're a meat eater, as I understand it, so you can relate. Yeah. But it's important to kind of think about 3 things. What is ecologically optimal? What is affordable? And what is achievable? And so for me, what we think about in terms of our sustainable food future, is it achievable that we're going to get everybody to go vegetarian?
Right.
Probably not. Is it feasible that we can come up with better and better meat alternatives and come up with better sort of substitutes for really environmentally intensive foods? I think so. Yeah. And that was also one of the sort of driving questions for me. That's why I went and ate, duck meat that had been grown in a bioreactor, this kind of lab meat thing.
Let's stop and talk about that for a second, because the idea that one of the statistics that is available widely now is that 1,800 gallons of water goes into every pound of meat, but you only actually eat every pound of cow, but you'd only eat a half of the cow.
That's right.
So there's all this water going into hoofs and horns and eyeballs
and brains.
So these guys at Memphis Meat said, what if we just take all of that out of the equation and try to make the meat growing process more efficient? What did you find?
What if you can grow the meat without the animal?
Yeah.
And that's actually a question that Winston Churchill, of all people, introduced, decades and decades ago, right? It was, there's so much inefficiency in meat, right? Because what we consume is less than half of the animal, right? So much energy, so much water and corn feed and fossil fuel inputs goes into growing all these parts of the animal that we don't eat, that are not nutrients. I mean, they definitely get used for other products, but they're much lower value products, and it just doesn't make sense, right? So I actually came into this story through Tyson Foods. Because I read that Tyson Foods was investing in this startup company, Memphis Meats, so had Cargill Meats. And I'm thinking, how is it that these very big traditional meat companies that produce billions of dollars of meat products a year are investing in a disruptive product? And not only that, this sort of Frankensteinian product that is, lab-grown meat. I mean, it just seemed so absurd to me. And so that got me further and further, eventually inside the laboratories of Memphis Meats and eating this lab-grown duck breast, that had been initially biopsied from a duck, presumably still sort of waddling around a farm in Petaluma, California, and they had taken those live cells. And enabled them to do what cells naturally do, which is self-replicate. And so, I mean, the more I research it, the more I realize it's not that weird.
And they weren't stem cells; they were just
they're cells. There are cells that self-replicate, and they're able to get those from within a muscle tissue. They can get it from fat tissues, and they can get it from connective tissues, which is all basically
when you eat a duck breast.
What you eat when you eat any kind of meat, right? It's those 3 components. So they can make those cells grow. And the cost has come down from hundreds of thousands of dollars a pound to several $100s a pound in about 3 years or so. So it's not available now, but it is certainly going to be available in the coming years. Meanwhile, we have plant-based meats and, all these different approaches from Beyond Meat, which had this massive IPO recently,
Right.
which is, totally plant-based. Impossible Foods, which produces that meat with the synthetic blood that is now going to be offered or already being offered in White Castle and Burger King and so on.
Shake Shack, right?
Shake Shack.
Yeah.
And it's delicious and hard to distinguish that from other ground beef.
Yeah.
So, what do you do? How do we do alternatives to, flank steak? Right. It's sort of easier to come up with an alternative to a beef patty,
right?
Because it's not, an actual sort of recognizable piece of meat.
Right.
It's
but the duck breast was recognizable.
The duck breast was recognizable.
Right. So it's,
and they said I went to sort of cut into it and take my first bite of this, lab-grown synthetic duck breast, and having signed, by the way, a contract that said, this is experimental and we are not responsible for the loss of your life. And I'm thinking,
you may turn into a duck.
That's right, exactly. But I, trusted Uma Valetti, who's the CEO, who had eaten it many times himself, and he looked pretty good.
Quack.
So I went ahead and signed it and ate it. And as I was sort of about to saw into this thing, Uma said, no, pick it up with your hands and pull it apart and sort of play with it.
Right.
See how it, feels and see how it sort of holds together. And I start prying it apart, and it, has all those, like that muscle tissue that you recognize, the striations and these different sort of, you can see the actual cells have grown as an actual meat grows. Right. And what he says is, this is at a molecular level identical to meat. Yeah. It's not, this is not plant-based meats, or it is meats. It's just, and they're live cells that even the craziest part of the whole thing was when they were showing me the cells growing in the petri dishes at different stages, and they said, oh, these cells, here's some cells that are actually contracting or spasming or flexing as a cell,
you can go
as muscle cells do.
Yeah.
And if you can, they'll do it spontaneously, but also if stimulated with electricity or caffeine. You put some caffeine in these dishes, and the cells and the meat muscle starts contracting. And I'm thinking, who's going to go for this?
Right.
This is just too weird. But in fact, the more sort of I learned about it and having tasted it, I realized that it makes so much environmental sense, and it makes actually so much sense from a safety standpoint, because this food is produced in very sanitary conditions instead of a slaughterhouse where they're mixing in fecal matter and there's all this contamination in the meats. Right. This is so safe.
In 100%.
And there's so much less bacteria.
In the slaughterhouse environment, in 100% of food tested, there was fecal matter in
That's right.
the sample.
In other words, exactly. Consumer Reports showed, that there's contamination. There's, some amount, a teaspoon or something of fecal matter in every pound of...
So lab meat is suddenly compelling.
Right, exactly. And if you're a parent trying to feed your kid and you're thinking what's safest for my child and what's safest for the environment, and eventually what's going to be probably more affordable because it requires so many fewer inputs, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah. It's just hard to get over. But then, just the sort of lab meat, it's weird. But then you think about, our current meat production system is so weird and so wrong and so ethically compromised that, what's weirder? I mean, in other words, you think about food origins.
It can only get better.
It can only get better. That's it. I'm gonna borrow that line.
You can have it. Yeah.
It can only get better.
How about fish is also a challenge because people are going to eat more fish. 20% of the world eats fish. Many more people than that should eat it,
actually,
right?
Seafood is the dominant protein source globally.
Oh, it's only here.
In the U.S. it's much lower than meat, but it's really interesting, and this is one of the arguments of the proponents of aquaculture is that, globally, fish is a much greater part of people's diets, particularly in Asia, than meats.
Right.
And the problem is that we're shifting away from fish and toward meats.
Right.
And so we need to avoid that. And fish, as you know, as an aquaculture buff, require much less sort of calorie per unit of food,
right.
because to produce, because they're cold-blooded, and they don't, so they require less sort of heat and caloric energy to keep the heat up for a four-legged, land animal.
Right.
They don't have to resist gravity because they're in water. So they're basically just so much more efficient
right.
to produce. That protein is so much more efficient to produce.
If you can get the feed right,
if you can get the feed
then
right.
you can, it converts to muscle.
That's right.
Almost directly, right?
Right. Some of the concerns about aquaculture have been that you have to use so much feed from seafood, from smaller fish,
right.
to produce these bigger fish like salmon,
right.
that you're basically, it's just not a good cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
But I met people in the aquaculture industry who are working on vegetarian feeds, where they get the feeds for the fish, not from actual fish,
Other
populations,
fish, right.
like herring and all these very valuable fish that are being fed to the big ones. Instead, they're getting it from algae,
right.
and which is what those littler fish actually eat. So they're going to the very beginning of the food chain, creating nutrients for the bigger fish without harvesting the little fish.
Right.
And
there's a great line in there. The protests about that is you can't feed lentils to lions. Salmon are this apex predator, and you're trying to get them on the kale.
Yes, I know. I loved that line too, because I said, well, why can't we just give these carnivorous fish, the salmon in particular, vegetarian fish feed? And the guy's like, you can't feed lentils to lions. Which was interesting, but then I actually talked to the scientist who said,
yes, you can.
You can give lentils to lions. In fact,
you just can't tell the lions.
Yeah. Well, the key thing is that if you feed them, you have to get the omega-3 fatty acids to give as part of the fish feed.
Right.
If they get the fish feed without that, then it's not expressed in the fish meat.
Right.
So as someone said, you can feed fish pretty much anything. They're not going to be this very high nutrient, valuable protein if it doesn't have the omega-3s. That's why people like to eat, for example, salmon. And so it would be like eating pink chicken if you feed.
Well, right, and when they were developing the salmon market, that what they were trying to always do is produce salmon so that they could sell it at market at the exact same price of chicken, so that you were taking the incentive was to find an alternative as a business proposition to chicken.
And so this is important because, I would love to be the consumer who always gets this wild salmon, but I have benefited from the lower cost of salmon, right, because I'd like to put it on the table in my household, once a week or twice a week. If it's very, very high cost salmon, I'm not going to be able to do that, right? So for a middle income consumer, the lower cost of salmon as a result of aquaculture has been a benefit. And I think it's easy for us to say, again, why can't we all just eat the sustainably harvested wild salmon? Right. But then it makes it a very elitist argument. It just is only available to consumers in a certain income bracket. Right. And there are problems with salmon farming for sure, but a lot of those problems have really come down and been addressed in recent years. And there's so much more to say about aquaculture, but essentially it's one area of many where there have been serious environmental costs and risks, where a lot of those have been addressed. Right. There are a lot of misconceptions about those risks, and we have to, really look at this pragmatically and bring kind of a new kind of honesty and pragmatism to the discussion around sustainable food.
Right. A lot of these people that you were talking to in this area, in GMOs and are all very cutting edge technology, and a lot of the stuff is very big think. Is there something that that I can do to start addressing the tremendous costs of food? Waste is an area that
I mean, the most humbling sort of, the area of research that was most sort of discouraging to me, but also I think most motivating, is food waste. We hear the statistic that more than a third, nearly 40% of all the food produced globally is wasted. It either rots in transit or it's thrown out, never makes it off the farm.
Right. Not good looking enough.
It's not good looking enough, yeah. And that's a real problem. I mean, our aesthetic standards for food are very unrealistic.
Right.
So there's been this ugly food movement that's had some, progress, but certainly not enough. I mean, we don't see much of it in our grocery stores. So beginning to think about and become aware of how much we fetishize beautiful food, and and thinking sort of beyond that a little bit more is one thing. Another thing is, in my own household, for me, really looking at how much we waste, and it's quite a lot.
How much comes into the house?
How much comes into the house?
Yeah, that's
how
my
much
problem too.
We throw out, and actually a lot of the healthiest diets, so plant-based diets, are the most wasteful. And the research that's come out of NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, for example, has looked at the amount of waste that's in households. For example, it's not happening to people who are eating Twinkies and Spam.
Right.
That stuff doesn't.
That stuff gets eaten.
Decay. It gets eaten. The stuff that gets thrown out is the huge head of kale and the extra.
So what's going to get thrown out in my refrigerator right now is the kale that we thought we were going to get to this week.
That's right. Yeah. And so we all sort of can come to terms with that. But it's also important to just consider that some of the changes that are really important and were, for me, the most exciting, were changes that are invisible, that you're not going to see really affecting our food future, but will. And the one that really impressed me the most was from this guy, Jorge Herrod, who's at Blue River Technology, and he produced a weeding robot with artificial intelligence that can essentially eliminate 90% of the herbicides that go on farms, because this intelligent robot can distinguish between plants and can deliver this sniper-like jet of herbicides instead of broadcast spraying, dumping huge amounts of chemicals on farms.
Just whack them one at a time.
Right, so wax them one at a time when they're babies, baby weeds. And then also this can be eventually, translated to fungicides and insecticides and fertilizers. Right. And so that kind of shift, really improving the way industrial agriculture works, making it more sustainable, more diverse, bringing principles of sustainable farming into large-scale farming, is some of the most sort of encouraging research that I came up.
Amanda?
That I found.
Amanda, thank you so much for joining me here at Salon Talks. It was a pleasure.